My name is Helen Collins. I'm 29 years old, and I work at the local library in a small town that most people probably haven't heard of. My life is simple, maybe too simple for some, but it's mine. I've always been the quiet type, preferring the company of books to the noisy outside world. The library is my safe place. It's a small old building with creaky floors and shelves that are a bit worn. But to me, it's perfect. Every day, I open the library doors at 8 o'clock a.m., turn on the lights, and breathe in the familiar scent of books. It's a routine that I never get tired of. My parents passed away when I was young, so my grandmother raised me. She was a kind woman who always encouraged me to read and learn. But she's gone now too, and I'm all alone. No siblings, no close relatives, just me and my small world. "Good morning, Helen," Mr. Jenkins, a regular visitor, greets me as he walks in. He's an elderly man who spends his days reading history books. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. The new shipment of history books arrived yesterday. I've set them aside for you," I reply with a smile. "Ah, you know me too well, dear," he chuckles, shuffling towards the designated shelf. The day goes on like this, with familiar faces coming and going. I help a group of kids find books for their school project, recommend a romance novel to Mrs. Harrison, and guide Mr. Thompson to the science fiction section. It's a quiet life, but I like it. I find comfort in the predictability, in the routine. And then one day, everything changed. The day Jack walked into my life. He came in looking for a book, but I could tell he wasn't the regular library type. He seemed out of place with his crisp suit and confident stride. "Can you help me find a book?" he asked, his voice smooth and inviting. "Of course. What are you looking for?" I replied, trying to stay calm. "It's a novel, The Great Gatsby," he said. "I believe it's right this way," I said, leading him to the classics section. As I handed him the book, our hands briefly touched, sending a jolt through me. It was just a simple touch, but it lingered in my mind. "Thank you, Helen," he said, reading my name tag. "I'm Jack." "It's nice to meet you, Jack." That brief encounter was the start of everything, the beginning of a love I thought would last forever, and the beginning of a journey that would take me from the quiet life I knew into a world of chaos and betrayal. If only I had known then what I know now, maybe things would have turned out differently. But life doesn't come with a warning, and sometimes we have to learn the hard way. After that first meeting, Jack started coming to the library more often. It was strange because he didn't seem like the reading type, but every time he visited, he'd ask for a book recommendation and then spend a few minutes chatting with me. One day, he walked in just as I was struggling with a box of newly arrived books. "Need a hand with that?" he offered, walking over. "That would be great, thanks," I said, relieved. As we placed the books on the shelves, he asked, "So, Helen, what got you into working at a library?" I shrugged. I've always loved books. They're like friends, you know? Plus, it's nice and quiet here. He laughed. "I can see that. It's like a whole different world." With each visit, our conversations grew longer. I found out that Jack worked in his family's real estate business. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like someone was genuinely interested in me. Then one day, he surprised me. "Helen, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, a hopeful look in his eyes. I was taken aback. "Like a date?" "Yes, like a date," he smiled. I hesitated. This was new territory for me, but there was something about him that made me want to say yes. "Okay, sure. I'd like that," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We went to a small restaurant in town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. We talked about everything and nothing, and for a few hours, I forgot about my usually solitary life. As we walked home, Jack said, "I had a really great time tonight, Helen. You're very different from the people I usually meet." I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled. He continued, "I'd like to see you again. Would that be okay?" I nodded. "Yes, I'd like that." From then on, we started seeing each other more regularly. He'd take me out to dinner, or we'd go for walks. It was nice. For once, I felt like I was part of something more, part of a world that wasn't just about books and quietness. It wasn't long before I fell for him hard. He was charming, attentive, and he made me feel special. And when he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I said yes. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs. I wish I had known that his charm was just a mask, hiding something much less pleasant. But love has a way of blinding you. of making you ignore the warning signs, and I was very much in love, or at least I thought I was. After I got engaged, things started to change. It began with Jack's parents, who didn't approve of me from the start. They thought I wasn't good enough for their son because I didn't come from money. The first time I met them, it was clear they didn't like me. We were at their house for dinner, and I was nervous. Their home was big and fancy, nothing like what I was used to. "Helen, this is my mother, Margaret, and my father, Richard," Jack introduced. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to smile. Margaret looked me up and down. So you're the girl who works at the library?" "Yes, I am," I replied, feeling smaller by the second. Richard chimed in, "Jack, couldn't you find someone more suitable?" I wanted to crawl into a hole. The dinner was long and uncomfortable. They made it clear they thought I wasn't good enough for their son, but Jack stood up for me, which made me love him even more. Before our wedding, they insisted on a prenuptial agreement. They said it was just a formality. I didn't have much to lose, so I agreed without making a fuss. After we got married, I moved into Jack's house, which was actually his parents' house. They had given it to him as a wedding gift, but they acted like it was still theirs. His parents came over all the time, unannounced. They'd walk in and start ordering me around. "Helen, make us some coffee," Margaret would demand as soon as she walked in, and I would, without saying anything. I didn't want to cause trouble. One day, Margaret pointed at the TV and said, "Remember, Helen, in case of divorce, you can't claim this." It was like that with everything. They constantly reminded me that nothing in the house was mine. Jack started changing too. He wasn't the man I fell in love with. He began joining in on the jokes his parents made about me. One evening, I was trying to decide what to wear for a family event. I asked Jack for his opinion. "This one makes you look less drab," he said, laughing. I was hurt. It was like he became a different person around his parents. He didn't stand up for me anymore. Instead, he laughed along with them. Living in that house was exhausting. I felt like an outsider, an unwanted guest. I kept hoping things would get better, but they only got worse. The stress got to me. I started having bad stomach pains. I tried to ignore them, but one day I collapsed at the library. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor said it was stress-related. I was in the hospital for a few days. Jack didn't visit. He didn't even call. I felt so alone. Then one day, a notary came to my room with news. My great-aunt, someone I barely remembered, had passed away and left me her fortune, $30 million. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even know what to do with that kind of money, but suddenly, I wasn't just the poor girl from the library anymore. When Jack and his parents found out, they came to visit, suddenly all smiles and sweetness. "Darling, we're so happy for you," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Yes, we're family. We should support each other," Richard added. I didn't buy it. The change in their behavior was too sudden. After they left, I overheard them talking outside my room. They didn't know I was listening. "She's such a fool. Can you believe our luck?" Jack laughed. "We need to make sure she doesn't leave you. Maybe you should have a child with her. That will tie her down," Margaret suggested. I felt sick to my stomach. They didn't care about me, they just wanted my money. That was when I knew I had to get out of that house and away from them. I had to take control of my life and not be their victim anymore. When I left the hospital, I had a plan in mind. As I got home, Jack and his parents were waiting for me, still all smiles and acting like the caring family they never were. "Oh, Helen, we were so worried about you," Margaret exclaimed. I nodded but didn't say much. I needed to act normal and not tip them off. Jack came closer, a little too eagerly. "So when do you get the inheritance?" he asked. I looked at Jack, the man I thought I loved, and realized I didn't even recognize him anymore. "Soon," I said, "but it's not something you need to worry about." His smile faltered a bit. "But we're married, Helen. What's yours is mine, right?" I forced a smile. "Of course, darling." That night, I couldn't sleep. Their voices echoed in my head. Their fake concern, their greed. It made me sick. I got up and started writing. I wrote down everything they had done and said. It felt like a dam had broken, and years of pent-up frustration and pain poured out. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. I explained everything and showed him the prenuptial agreement. He was shocked but said the agreement would protect me. "You're doing the right thing," he assured me. When I got back home, I found Jack and his parents in the living room. They looked up as I walked in. There she is, our brave girl, Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I sat down, clutching my purse. I have something to say, I began. They all looked at me curious. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. The room went silent. Then Margaret erupted. What? You ungrateful little. Jack was on his feet. Helen, you can't be serious. We love you. Do you, Jack? Because I don't feel loved. I feel used. Margaret was fuming. We'll sue you. We'll take half of your inheritance. I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the prenuptial agreement. Actually, you can't. This says neither of us can claim the other's property in case of divorce. They were speechless. For the first time, I felt in control. I stood up and said, I'm leaving. I don't want any of you to contact me. I walked out of the house, their shouts and insults following me. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But as I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free from their disdain and manipulation. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. I didn't know what the future held, but it had to be better than the past. I rented a small apartment in the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I was still dealing with the divorce, but I felt like I could handle it. One day, I got a call from the lawyer. Helen, there's something you should know about your great-aunt's will. I was puzzled. What about it? There's a condition. You need to use a portion of your inheritance for a charitable cause. It was your great-aunt's final wish. I was surprised. I had no idea. The lawyer continued. She was quite the philanthropist. She wanted to pass that on to you. I hung up the phone, deep in thought. My great-aunt had given me a chance to do something good. It felt like a sign, a push in a new direction. I started researching charities and causes. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that would make a difference. That's when I found a small organization that helped women who were victims of domestic abuse. It struck a chord with me. I contacted them and set up a meeting. The woman I met, Linda, was passionate and dedicated. We provide shelter, legal aid, and counseling to women who have nowhere else to go, Linda explained. I listened, moved by the stories she shared. I want to help, I said, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. With Linda's guidance, I used part of the inheritance to fund a new shelter. It was an incredible feeling, knowing I was helping other women find a way out, just like I had. A few weeks later, Linda invited me to the shelter's opening. It was a small event, but the atmosphere was filled with hope and gratitude as people mingled. I noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Sarah, an old colleague from the library. Helen, is that you? She asked, surprised. Sarah, it's been so long, I said, hugging her. What are you doing here? She asked. I told her about the shelter and my involvement. Her eyes widened in amazement. That's incredible, Helen. I had no idea. It's a new chapter for me, I said, smiling. We spent the evening catching up. It felt great to reconnect with an old friend, like pieces of my life were slowly falling back into place. As the event wrapped up, Linda came over. Helen, I can't thank you enough. This shelter will change lives, she said. I looked around at the faces of the women who now had a safe place to go. It's the least I could do, I said, feeling a warmth in my heart that I hadn't felt in a long time. The days blended together, each filled with rewarding work at the shelter. I was finding a new sense of purpose, something that was truly mine. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in a while. Jack. My heart raced with a mix of emotions and curiosity. Hello, Jack, I answered, trying to keep my voice calm. Helen, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? It's urgent. His voice sounded desperate. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him at a public coffee shop, hoping that being in a familiar place would give me strength. Sitting across from Jack, he looked different, defeated, almost pitiful. His eyes were pleading. Helen, I made a huge mistake. I want you back. I've realized how much you mean to me, he blurted out. I looked at him, feeling nothing but contempt. Why now, Jack? He sighed. My parents, they controlled everything. They were the reason our marriage failed. I was weak, but I'm different now. I felt a surge of anger. You blame your parents? You stood by while they treated me like dirt. You laughed along with them. Jack reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, Helen. I know I was wrong. I've changed. I stared at him, seeing the man he had become. I once loved Jack, but now I felt nothing for him. Whether he had changed or not, it was too late. I said, I feel nothing for you, Jack, nothing but contempt. His face fell, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I had married, but it was fleeting. I'm sorry, Jack. I've moved on. I have a life now, a purpose. There's no place for you in it, I said firmly. He nodded slowly, a look of resignation on his face. I understand. I just had to try. Leaving the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over, truly over. The next day, the shelter had an event. A local artist had donated a sculpture to be unveiled in the garden. As I stood there, surrounded by people who supported and believed in me, I felt a sense of belonging. Sarah, my old colleague from the library, stood beside me. You've done something amazing here, Helen, she said, smiling. The artist pulled the cover off the sculpture, revealing a figure of a woman reaching up to the sky. It symbolized hope, strength, and new beginnings. Applause filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. Linda, the woman who had helped me so much, came over. Helen, this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do. I looked around at the hopeful faces and knew she was right. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it fully. My new life was busy and fulfilling. Every day at the shelter brought new challenges and rewards. My confidence grew, and for the first time in years, I felt in control of my destiny. I even started taking self-defense classes, something I would have never imagined doing before. One day, as I was leaving the shelter, I saw a car parked outside. It was my mother-in-law, Margaret, who stepped out. As soon as she saw me, she said, Helen, we need to talk, her voice softer than I had ever heard. I have nothing to say to you, Margaret, I replied, my voice steady. Please just hear me out. I've realized how wrong we were, she pleaded. I stopped and looked at her. She seemed genuine, but I couldn't forget the past. What do you want, Margaret? I want to apologize. I treated you terribly. I've lost my son because of it, and I don't want to lose you too. You were like the daughter I never had, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I felt a pang of sympathy, perhaps, but I pushed it away. Margaret, you made my life a living hell. An apology won't change that. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same. I said firmly, it's too late for that. Goodbye, Margaret. She reached out to me, but I stepped back. Please, Helen. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right, she pleaded. I shook my head. Goodbye, Margaret. As I walked away, I felt her gaze on my back, but didn't look back. I had learned to stand up for myself, and there was no going back. The next day, I received a letter from Jack's lawyer. He was contesting the divorce settlement. I wasn't surprised, but I was ready. I met with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel. He's got no leg to stand on, Helen. The prenuptial agreement is clear. He's just trying to intimidate you, she said confidently. I nodded. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Let's fight this. When the court date arrived, I walked in with my head held high. Jack was there with his lawyer, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was a flash of the old Jack, the one I had loved, but it vanished quickly. The judge listened to both sides and then made her decision. The prenuptial agreement stood, and Jack's claims were dismissed. I felt a surge of relief and triumph. After the court session, Jack approached me. Helen, I'm sorry. I was wrong, he said, his voice low. I looked at him, seeing the man I once loved but now felt nothing for. Goodbye, Jack. Take care of yourself, I said and walked away. As I left the courtroom, I felt a sense of closure. That chapter of my life was finally over, and a new one was just beginning. At the shelter, we were planning a fundraiser, and it was taking all my attention. The support from the community was overwhelming, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the place was buzzing with energy. People from all walks of life had come to support our cause. As I looked around, I realized how far I had come, from a quiet, timid woman to someone who stood up for herself and others. Helen, you did it. This is amazing, Sarah said, coming up to me. I smiled and replied, we did it. And there's so much more to do. As the event went on, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and purpose. This was my life now, and I was exactly where I was meant to be.